Welcome back to English 210. This is Emerson's Divinity School Address, so called. This is a graduation address that Emerson delivered to the Harvard Divinity School graduating class in 1838. And it's quite famous. It made him quite famous in his time. He was already on his way toward fame and renown. And he was he was in effect banned from Harvard for about 50 years after delivering this address. So while you're reading this or listening to this lecture about this address, the claims might not seem to you quite as provocative as they were to Emerson's audience, but these were quite daring things to say. And imagine yourself going before a graduating class and telling them, in effect, that much of what they've learned was useless, and actually meaning what you said, not using that as a kind of rhetorical way into some other kind of discussion of what they had learned, so or what the class had learned. So we're going to review what made this address so controversial and then subsequently famous, and why it's referred to often. When you think of Emerson, you think of the Divinity School Address, you think of the American Scholar, and you think of self-reliance. So we'll talk about this. So try to keep in mind that this really did, even if it's difficult to sort of get into, or the language sounds a bit archaic, or the claims sound not quite as provocative to a modern ear as they would to Emerson's audience, that this was quite provocative. And it was quite a bold thing to do for a young-ish, he would have been about 35 by this time, young-ish lecturer, unsure of a career, having left the ministry to have returned to Harvard and given this kind of speech. So with that in mind, let's go to what the claim is, really, of the essay. And I shouldn't say the sort of overall claim, but the general purpose of this essay, rather address, is outlined or in a statement on page 78. So go to 78 and you'll find in the second full paragraph that begins, "And now, my brothers," I'll just read up till the line that I'm getting to. "And now, my brothers, you will ask, what in these desponding days can be done by us? The remedy is already declared in the ground of our complaint of the church. We have contrasted the church with the soul. In the soul, then, let the redemption be sought." So the church with the soul, notice that both are capitalized. Emerson is here delivering his strongest and most public address against institutionalized Christianity, right? So against the institution of the church, not against the soul, not against religion itself or per se, but against the Christian church, and specifically in this address, the Unitarian church. So the Unitarian Christian church here is being is what he's discounting. Not everything, not all of it, but that institutionalized Unitarianism, the church, has done some damage to religion. And so he wants to talk about why that is and how we need to return to the soul. As he says, in the soul, then, let the redemption be sought. This should sound quite familiar. We've seen this in the 3 earlier sermons that we've read from Emerson, this contrasting of the soul, or the individual mind of man, seeking understanding of this larger soul that contains everything, this larger God that contains everything, seeking understanding on one's own, unmediated, without a mediator, without some other human being in the way, even without Jesus Christ in the way, although Jesus can be a good teacher, he can be a good helper along the way. But we want to do this directly, not through mediation, not through another man, right? Man, again, being used generically here because it's Emerson's word. But we take our own souls and we go to the source directly. So it's the same kind of message, but here he is actually criticizing specifically the Unitarian Church, specifically to the graduating class of preachers who are going out now into the world looking to Emerson for guidance. So this is what he tells them, that the church is a problem. All right, so let's go through 11 points, basically. I'm going to read 11 short moments throughout the essay and explain sort of where he's coming from. But there are two main points that he is making in this essay that help him to explain why he thinks we have institutionalized religion. Church has become the new God rather than the soul. So we'll come back to these two main points. We'll close with those, but we're going to lead up to them first. And I haven't told you what those 2 points are. We're going to lead up to them. But they're leading up to a way to clarify why he thinks the institution has too much power and we need to return to the soul. All right, so if we open, I'm not going to read the full opening paragraph of the essay, but speech, address. But this is an interesting turn that he makes in his writing. So we do not any longer have, now this isn't a sermon, but we don't have a scriptural epigraph. You wouldn't necessarily expect that anyway. But there's no sort of epigraph, but there is now an opening with a lovely description of nature. Now this is a turn that Emerson begins to take. He has already begun to take this in the 1830s. We're going to backtrack and read some of his earlier writings. But he's turning away, not turning away from religion, but he's beginning to use more images and more sort of ways of thinking about man's place in the universe by using man's place in nature and man's place in larger systems by way of using man's place in nature. These lovely analogies. We're going to start seeing a boy or a man looking out into the natural world and imagining his place there and pondering and wondering. And this is going to be an analogy or a metaphor for the soul before God in a certain sense. So I won't read the entire paragraph, but look at the opening line. In this refulgent summer, it has been a luxury to draw the breath of life. The grass grows, the buds burst, the meadow is spotted with fire and gold in the tint of flowers, the air is full of birds, and sweet with breath of pine, the balm of Gilead, and the new hay. So this goes on and on. And man under them, if you skip down just a bit, seems a young child, and his huge globe a toy. So there's man looking out at all of this, and he feels wowed and attracted, and his attention is fully paid to this scene, right? So we know that Emerson likes to pay attention. So here he says, if you turn the page to page 70 at the bottom of this paragraph, we're told that all the planters, the mechanics, the inventors, the astronomers, the builders of cities, and the captains, history delights to honor, right? So all of these people, these men in this case, who have gone out and done things in the world, have begun with this sort of fascination with the natural scene and how the world works and how what man's place might be there. Now I'm going to read this full paragraph at the top of page 70 to explain what the mind needs to do, the human mind, the mind of man, so to speak, in order to do something with this scene, in order, you might say, to receive a kind of instruction from it. Remember that receive and act, that two-part movement in Emerson that we see all of the time. So, but when the mind opens and reveals the laws which traverse the universe, he's out there looking at everything, and then something happens, right? The mind opens, and what happens as this spectator, this man or this boy in other places, as we'll see, what happens as this spectator looks out and tries to comprehend the scene and take it all in? Well, the mind is opening, and when it opens, reveals the laws which traverse the universe and makes things what they are, then shrinks the great world at once into a mere illustration and fable of this mind. This is an amazing movement. So all of this suddenly synthesizes, and all of this viewing of the natural world and one's place within it synthesizes, and we start to see laws traversing the universe. We start to see what makes all of this into one thing and what explains how it all comes together. Not that we're going to sit down and write the rules, it's not like that, but we just start to see a unity in all of it. It starts to make sense as a whole, makes things what they are, right? So it's sort of like looking at a house and looking at individual pieces and then realizing suddenly how to build it, that there's a foundation, that there's a structure to it, that there's order to it. That's a silly example, but imagine a child starting to imagine how to put things together. So then the questions that follow, right, are that, well, they follow after realizing that this world is an illustration of the fable of the mind. The mind is making all of this make sense. So in a sense, not in a literal sense, but in a certain kind of sense, the mind is making all of this. It's bringing it in and making sense of it. What am I? What is? Remember, Emerson likes to ask these questions. He likes to know what is, how things are. Asks the human spirit with a curiosity new kindled, but never to be quenched. So everything's open now. This mind is curious, and it will never be fully satisfied. It will always be curious. Behold these outrunning laws, outrunning which our imperfect apprehension can see tend this way and that, but not come full circle. So we can have a sense of what these larger laws are, but we can never fully understand them. We're human, we're limited. Behold these infinite relations, so like, so unlike, many yet one. I would study, I would know, I would admire forever. These works of thought have been the entertainments of the human spirit in all ages. All right, so this, excuse me, this mind is opened up, right? So where are we going? Well, let's see. Let's go down to what we perceive. We start to understand laws. We start to understand how things are put together. If you go down toward the bottom of the page on page 70, we move to a kind of higher level, and we read in the beginning of the second to last paragraph, the penultimate paragraph, the intuition of the moral sentiment is an insight of the perfection of the laws of the soul. That is a packed sentence. It's Emerson at his worst and his best, packing everything into one sentence. But what we have here and what he's saying, and we're going to follow up on this in just a second, we're going to have an intuition of some kind, into an insight into the laws of the soul, right? So the laws of how there's something larger that orders everything in the visible world. There's something that explains to us how all of these laws are working, and these laws execute themselves. Now I'm going to read another sentence that helps clarify this a little bit. So flip over to page 71, almost right across the page there, and the next to last paragraph there. The perception of this law of laws awakens in the mind a sentiment which we call the religious sentiment and makes our highest happiness. Now here he's using the term religious sentiment synonymously with moral sentiment. For him they're the same. He uses them synonymously. He does this elsewhere, specifically in his first essay that he had written for a magazine called The Dial, or a little journal called The Dial that was very important in 1840. But he uses the term moral sentiment and religious sentiment synonymously, and you can just trust me on that. So here he says this kind of sentiment. Now he doesn't mean sentiment as in lovey-dovey hallmarky sentiment. He means a sense of what is, right? Something sort of, you can't quite fully comprehend it, but you have an insight into the way things are in some way. It's a sentiment. And this is admittedly a bit fuzzy. He's going into territory that's really difficult to explain, but he's actually trying to capture that sense of when we as human beings, our mind opens up and we have an insight. What is that like, right? And it's not like just understanding or memorizing a law or it's having a sort of sense of the way things are that you can't always necessarily explain very well. So he says we call it a religious, it makes us the highest happiness, right? So continuing down to the bottom of that paragraph on page 71, let's just read the last sentence here Thought may work cold and intransitive things and find no end or unity, but the dawn of the sentiment of virtue on the heart gives and is the assurance that law is sovereign over all natures. So this sentiment, there's some sense that there is a law of laws, right? That there is some larger law that organizes everything. He's referring here again to a God or a sense of the soul. He's going to use these words synonymously. He's trying to get away again from this idea of God sitting on the throne, watching over, and moving toward an idea of God being this larger force in the world that organizes the way things are. And that's about as clear as he ever gets on it. He's trying to describe the sense of how he thinks a divine force works. So if we look just up above to the beginning of the first full paragraph on that page, that begins, "These facts have always suggested to man," he will call this larger force, or this larger God in some way, of one mind active everywhere. So this is the way, again, that he can be really confusing with this. He'll synonymously use the word soul and mind, and then sometimes not so synonymously. And this really is a difficulty in Emerson. But this idea, this one great mind, this one great soul, something that contains all of us, but that the human mind and the human soul is able to understand this larger order of things because it's a part of it, and because it is in some ways like this larger thing. We've seen this quite a lot, this likeness to God, be like this larger soul. So again, you're able to understand this larger order because you're somehow a part of it and have it sort of through you and of you in some way. So it's sort of like you could think of it this way. It's as if, well, this is actually going to be a terrible analogy probably, but the human body is made up mostly of water, right? But we don't see the water. We see liquids in our bodies, but we're 90s, I don't know the percentage, but we're mostly water. And so much of the universe, what is it made of? It's made of hydrogen and oxygen and everything that follows from that. So in a sense, this is saying, you're already part of everything else, or you're already like everything else. This whole universe is made of basically the same things, sort of broken down and differentiated almost infinitely, but we're all essentially made of the same stuff. So it kind of works as an analogy. All right, so let's then look to page 72. And at the top of page 72 in the first full paragraph, this sentiment, it begins with this sentiment again. So what does this moral sentiment do? What is this insight into the law of laws, into the way things are? What does it do for us? Well, he says this sentiment lies at the foundation of society. Foundation is a really important word here. You'll see a lot of this in Emerson. Foundations, we've seen this before, building, right? This sentiment is at the foundation and successively creates all forms of worship. There's the word form again, right? And if you read through, and I won't summarize everything he says in this address, but this is what gets us started with what we've received it. We've received this insight. We've had this intuition. The sentiment has informed us of the law of laws, of the order in the universe, of what is, and now we're going to act, right? Successively creates forms of worship. So forms are things that are observable, that we can follow, right? They're ritualistic practices in this particular sense right here, talking about religion and what he's addressing in this lecture. But everything that we build that is worth repeating, or that is worth, or that everything begins with this sentiment. Like you have something that you want to act upon, and building or expressing in some way your reception of these higher principles is how inventions happen. He'll say this, we're going to see more of this in his subsequent writings. But this idea, this principle of veneration, he says in the next line, is really important, right? So this successively creates all forms of virtue. So again, forms are not bad. We make things. We're human beings. We make things. We're going to go a little bit further to what's happened, and you can probably see this coming. It's when we start to accept these forms at second hand, and that we don't make them for ourselves, and that we're not choosing to participate them. There is no feeling behind them. This is the problem. It's not the forms themselves. It's that we're not ourselves originating them anymore. When we start as individuals to fail to originate, this is the problem. And this isn't ideal. I mean, it's impossible to live an entire life originating all the time. But this is what he's trying to express or explain, that has become the primary problem with the church, and we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so he says at the beginning of the next paragraph, part basically of what I was just saying about not taking anything at second hand, about having to originate. So he says in the beginning of the next paragraph, still on 72, meanwhile, whilst the doors of the temple stand open, night and day before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never, it is guarded by one stern condition, this namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Now think about that. If you have an intuition, you can't receive it. Someone can't say, let me give you my intuition. That's not, someone can tell you about his or her own intuition, but cannot give you that intuition. You have to experience it on your own. There's the idea, again, of first-hand experience rather than receiving something at second hand. And there's that receiving, again, that idea. So we've seen this repeatedly in Emerson so far. So truly speaking, it is not instruction but provocation that I can receive from another soul. So this is a wonderful and rather famous statement, claiming that, and it seems to make really practical sense. You can be, strictly speaking, you can only be provoked to learn on your own, right? You can only be provoked to have your own intuitions. Someone can't instruct you in them. They can help provoke you there, they can help get you there, but you've got to do it on your own. So this is, again, leading up to his claims that he's going to make about the church, which come at the bottom of the page. So all of this up until now has been pretty introductory. It's been an introduction to his larger ideas again, specifically leading up to this larger criticism of the church that's coming, and of too much formalism, right? Too much empty practicing of formal rituals without the affection, without the sentiment being present. And we're going to get, so the two errors specifically. So if you go down to the paragraph, I'm still in 72, that begins these general views, this is where we begin, or Emerson begins, to discuss the problems with the church. So everything up to now has been introductory, very important introductory material, but here is where the specific claims about the church come in. So at the end of that same paragraph, that these general views paragraph, he says, I shall endeavor to discharge my duty to you on this occasion by pointing out two errors in its administration in the church, in the administration of this sentiment of virtue, which daily appear more gross from the point of view we have just now taken. Now, these two errors I'm going to point out to you right now, and he points them out himself, numbers 1 and number 2, but I'm going to read them and briefly summarize them. These are the two ways, going back to the beginning of this lecture, in which the Emerson is saying that the church has overtaken the soul. Okay? That the church has been contrasted to specifically the soul, that line on page 78. So the first point is on 73, and I'm going to read it briefly. The first point is this defect of historical Christianity. Historical Christianity meaning the way that men have practiced Christianity, right? The way that human history has practiced this faith. Not the way that it is, but the way that men have carried it out. So historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us, and as it has appeared for ages, it is not the doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual. In other words, the formal, right? The formal and what we can see and what is particular, the personal, the positive, not positive as in good, but positive as in you can point to it, you can see it, it's an expression, it's visible. So personal positive rituals. So obsession with, let's take the Catholic Church in this case, but the obsession with the priest and the figure of the Pope and the particular rituals and so on. So this is all in the category of the forms of things that we can see, of things that are repeatable, right? So exaggeration of all that doesn't mean that we need to do away with it, but it's been grossly exaggerated. This is what historical Christianity has done and has forgotten about that the soul in its attempt. So too much emphasis on the observable and not enough emphasis on the soul and bringing individual human minds and souls to understand themselves before God. So that's the first problem, exaggeration of this personal and positive, observable, and so on. The second problem is on the bottom of page 74. So here he says, the second defect of the traditionary and limited way of using the mind of Christ is a consequence of the first, of this exaggeration of ritual and formal, and the formal. This, namely, that the moral nature, that law of laws, remember that, whose revelation introduced greatness, yea, God himself, into the open soul, is not explored as the fountain of the established teaching in society. Lots of words there. And what he's basically saying is we've relied on, right? We have not been trying to go back to the source, to this one soul or one mind before God. We have instead acted as if, as he says in the next sentence, all of that happened at one great time, and now we're just receiving everything at second hand. This is a problem. He wants to recall all of us back to our own souls and our own need to experience God directly and this law of laws directly. And so he says in the next sentence, men have come to speak of the revelation as somewhat long ago. See, it's over with. It happened once. Everything was revealed once to, for example, the prophet Moses or so on. But given and done as if God were dead. The injury to faith throttles the preacher, and the goodliest of institutions becomes an uncertain and inarticulate voice. So what he's saying there is that we've followed up on this. Revelation happened once, and now we're just repeating basically someone else's revelation, right? Someone else's insight into the law of laws, into understanding the larger force, God, that organizes and sort of, in a sense, is the whole universe, right? So what we need to do then is, or the result of that is, if we continue to go just a little bit down the page on 75, if we go to the beginning of the second full paragraph, the man enamored, right, becomes its priest or poet. But observe the condition, the spiritual limitation of the office. The Spirit only can teach, not any profane man, not any sensual, right? So it's taking the emphasis away from individual men who teach and saying that the Spirit needs to teach. Now that's kind of, how do we, then we would never need any teachers. Well, he says, we do need teachers, but what kind do we need? Keep going down in the paragraph. The man on whom the soul descends, through whom the soul speaks, alone can teach. So a man, if you think, a man needs simply not to speak himself or not to speak as if he is the important one delivering the address. And you can probably think of people who just have huge egos who are speaking, and it's really all about them. It's not necessarily about the message or what the message might say to others. This is kind of what he means. But the man basically has to be a channel through which the Spirit speaks. This is the best kind of speaker. This is the most, for Emerson, truly moral kind of speaker who's trying as best he can to speak the soul, to speak this kind of larger truth. And the emphasis not on him, but on the message delivered and on the truth. So on this insight into the law of laws. Now again, remember, as he said earlier, strictly speaking, all this preacher can do is provoke. He can't really teach. He can't provide others with this insight or these intuitions, but he can try to provoke them to go out and have their own. And that's what Emerson would like them to be able to do, to get people to go out and have their own revelations, right? So if we go down further in the page, then he continues, or rather summarizes a bit, with a specific note about preaching again. And he says in 75, last paragraph, about 6 or 7 lines down, he says, this great and perpetual office of the preacher is not discharged, right? But here's what should happen. Preaching is the expression of the moral sentiment and application to the duties of life. That's the simplest kind of expression of what he thinks a preacher should be able or should be trying to do. So you're expressing the moral sentiment and the application to the duties of life. In other words, the preacher is trying to not only inspire others to have their own revelations and to gain their own intuitions and insights, but also to figure out what to do with them afterwards. So there's that idea of receiving and acting again. So what do we do? How do we apply all of this to a human life? And again, this makes perfect sense following the movement that Emerson follows, inward and outward, receive and act, and it also is following in the tradition of writing a sermon, in a sense. You know, you think about the doctrine, you consider the doctrine, and then you suggest applications to a human life, what we should do with this doctrine. All right, so the final criticism he makes, or where he kind of sums things up, is at the top of page 76, first full paragraph, third line on the page on 76. When the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, there's that word, formalist, then is the worshiper defrauded and disconsolate. So again here, the formalist, you've got a footnote on this here, but we've talked about this a lot. He's not doing away with forms and rituals altogether, but someone who is strictly a formalist, right? Simply abides by forms and has no soul, is not speaking the soul, is not speaking from one's own intuitions, is not speaking insights, but is simply following forms, is worthless, basically, has nothing to teach and nothing, and it will be incapable of provoking anybody else. So again, we have at the top of the next page, a reference back to the Lord's Supper and the creaking formality of that, as he says, is how it's become to be practiced. So this is the way, however, that we have overvalued the church and the institutions and the rituals at the expense of the soul, at the expense of the individual receiving insights via the moral sentiment, being opened up and having this feeling, opening the mind, being able to understand sort of a larger set of laws, organizing everything in one's vision, and then organizing everything that maybe we can't see, that sort of comes in and helps us to understand how a larger level of order of existence might work. Very fuzzy, I realize, but we are talking about invisibles and divinities and forces and eternity and larger things that, you know, the human mind can imagine but can't necessarily really make sense of in any kind of measurable way ever. So he's trying to step beyond what we can see and think about what we can't see and what orders everything beyond. And so at the top of page 79 is where we're going to close. And he's going to say to the preachers before him, the graduating preachers, let me admonish you, top of page 79. So here's the final sort of instruction to these preachers that he'll give them. Let me admonish you first of all to go alone. And we know this. And it doesn't mean be independent, go off on your own, be completely self-absorbed. He's not talking about that. So remember this from the Trust Yourself essay, and the ways that he discusses self-reliance there. It's not about being, I gotta be me. It's not that. It's that you need to have the experience of God directly, yourself, for yourself, if you are going to be able to say anything useful or inspiring, provocative about it. So go alone, refuse the good models, even those which are sacred in the imagination of men, and dare to love God without mediator, on your own, right? And at the beginning of the next paragraph, right below, yourself a newborn bard of the Holy Ghost, of the Holy Spirit. We've got a bard, someone who sings like a muse, as if directly from speaking the soul, speaking the divine messages. And this is exactly the way that Homer opens up the Odyssey and the Iliad, the muses speaking directly from the gods. They call upon the gods to speak through them. And it's this kind of idea, speak through me. Cast behind you all conformity and acquaint men at first hand with the deity. Look to it first and only. There's that idea again. So acquaint others with divinity directly. Now that's impossible because you're doing it for them, but do the best you can, and then they might go off and try to find it on their own if they have not already in some way. So this got him banned from Harvard for about 50 years. There's now a building there named after him, so he's doing just fine. But this was a very provocative statement that was taken by many to, and in some ways, quite rightly to mean that Emerson was telling all of these young preachers to completely forget what they had learned. He wasn't being that extreme, although imagine hearing this address and hearing him basically tell them to reject even the good models. In other words, go out, find out for yourself, and try to teach that. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture, and now we're going to go on to the American Scholar, in which Emerson makes kind of the same claims, but now about not how we go to the scriptures or how we deal with religious conceptions, but how we actually deal with all kinds of literature, all kinds of writing, all kinds of words that come from others, right? So we'll get to that. Okay.